Alright guys, welcome into Formula 1 news. After Ferrari say their car will be 99% different for next year, we have a response from McLaren and potentially also from Red Bull in terms of how they are approaching next year. McLaren also, it seems, are not going to evolve their next year's car, but actually they have many new ideas they want to bring to 2025 to such an extent. Andrea Stella says they want to make next year's championship more boring than this one was because they're trying to win both constructors and drivers very easily indeed. The other teams seemingly do not believe it is going to be that simple by any means. What do you think in the comment section below? Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into today, starting with another Aston Martin story. We got Mike Crack again saying that Lance Stroll, he's unfairly treated and all this. Look, at the end of the day, if Stroll seemed to care a bit more about the sport, I'd have a bit more sympathy for him. Tough to have sympathy anyway. The reality is that car is probably going to make some good progress in 2026, if not maybe next year. Newey's joining the team. They've got all the pieces, Aston Martin, to be a championship winner, not even a championship contender from top to bottom of the organisation. But again, it is the Stroll piece that puts some questions in. And even when you see this type of information, it doesn't make it sound great, does it? Because Stroll has not scored an especially high amount of points over the last couple of seasons, but I think the key point is he's scored so few with respect to Alonso that even if you just eliminated him from the championship entirely, it would have made no difference for the last 2 years. So yeah, the last 2 seasons, Aston Martin have been 5th behind what's turned out to be the big 4, Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes. Of course, last year Aston started very well, then things quickly fell off a cliff and they ended up 5th. But even without Stroll, last year they'd have been 5th, this year they'd have been 5th. So, it's not like he's irrelevant, but maybe it's not too far off, although of course the team will tell you differently. The car gets better. I think Stroll might be a bit more engaged, but of course it's not like he's going to be good enough to consistently challenge Alonso anyway. I'm just talking about this because there's been lots of discussion around Yuki Tsunoda and his future and whether Aston Martin and Honda could be something that makes a fair bit of sense. More explanation from Red Bull on their decision-making process as well going through. Horner also mentioned how Perez will be a team representative still, so it's a bit unclear what the relationship break-off has actually been between these two parties because Perez was never going to just say, oh, I retire, although Horner is now coming out and saying, oh no, Perez decided to take a sabbatical, even though Perez said nothing of the sort when he confirms his departure from the team. Whatever you want to believe, Perez is still, to some degree, for now, part of the Red Bull family. He's going to be still involved with the team. He'll be doing a couple of show runs for us next year, he says. So, yeah, maybe those are the final couple of sponsor things that he's got before he sets off sail into the distance. Perez, of course, being replaced by Liam Lawson, and Lawson said the following about Perez. I thought it was kind of funny because I think Lawson recognises this is what he should say, but it kind of seems to imply as well that he thinks he is the better man for the job than Perez. And, fair enough, so do I. I'm just not sure he was the best man for the job. But as he says, I've got a huge amount of respect for what he's done in the sport and what he's done for this team. In a way, it's probably big shoes to fill, but obviously it's exciting. So I like that. In a way, it's probably big shoes to fill because that obviously implies that in his minds, he doesn't really see it as big shoes to fill because, how many points has he got to score to outdo Perez? Not that many in the grand scheme of things. But of course, Perez, in some level, he's right that Perez is a big character to replace because it's not been sunshine and rainbows at all for Perez next to Max, but he has held out in that seat for 4 years, which is more than the other contemporaries could manage over recent years as well. However, Red Bull are being pretty clear to Lawson about what his role is in the first year. Now, I think you could put Yuki in the seat and you'd get a similar setup, but obviously we know that Red Bull do not want anyone to challenge Max too much. They'd want someone who can beat Max 4 to 5 times a season, maybe, as in they're good enough to beat Max, they are good enough to contribute to the constructors. So, you want someone capable of beating your main driver a handful of times, but ideally not, 12 times, because then it's going to get very intense between the pair of them if there's 24 races in a season, and ideally not 1 time or 0 times, because then you run into problems, as we have seen for various teams over the last few years. So Horner was pretty clear on this, that he will be the supporting cast on some level level. And I think that's expected for the first year, although Lawson definitely has a different opinion in terms of what he's going to try and achieve in 2026 and beyond. But yeah, he was asked the question whether this decision to sign Lawson was there to complement Verstappen, and Horner was like, yeah, absolutely. If you liken it to football, you can't have two elite centre forwards. You've got to have strength and depth in your team. I think that with Liam, with the experience that he's got coming into the team, which isn't much to be fair compared to someone like Yuki, but you know, it is what it is there to provide that strength and depth that we need from an engineering perspective, from a tactical perspective, because it's going to be tight next year. So these are all just buzzwords that he says, in my opinion. From an engineering perspective, what does he even mean there? From a tactical perspective, sure, I get it, because you are going to need, ideally, if you're Max, someone at least in the same postcode as you, so that from a strategical perspective during Grand Prix, you can pull an undercut, you can have somebody hold somebody else up, as Norris did to Perez in Baku this year, for example. So Horner goes on, you've got Ferrari that'll have very strong drivers, Hamilton, Leclerc, you've got Norris and Piastri at McLaren. There's contradicting aspects within F1, because on the one hand, you've got the team and the drivers are contractors to the team. On the other side, you've got the Drivers' Championship, where the interest and, of course, the individual interest is. So, look, he makes it very clear. He is our lead driver. If you can get close to him, fantastic. But the reality is, the expectation is for Max to win. So, look, we know this to be true, but it's pretty rare that Red Bull actually say it. Like, usually they kind of just imply it, that Max is the number one. But, no, they're making it very evident, and Horner is being very honest with us maybe for once and saying, look, he's our lead driver. We expect Max to win. And, of course, if you expect Max to win, you also expect your teammate to Max to play the supporting cast. A team like Ferrari, are they going to have two drivers that are going to go take points off each other? Which horse do you hold back? You have to back both of them. Sometimes that's divisive in the team. Different teams have different approaches. So we know this is the thing with Red Bull, but it's, if you're Lawson hearing this, you're thinking, well, he's talking about Ferrari and saying, oh, well, you know, you can't have Leclerc and Hamilton in the same team. It's going to cause problems because you've got to back one over the other at some point, which is true, and it is a concern for Ferrari. But will it not guarantee them, but will it guarantee them a better chance of the constructors? Sure. It's the drivers that both of those guys have to worry about. Maybe that's not the team's problem on some level until it is as the season goes on. But Lawson is effectively being told, don't, you know, get too close to Max. Just be the supporting cast for now anyway. And that's the strategy. And this is Red Bull's strategy. They've played it before and it works. I mean, you back one man, it gives that one man the best chance of winning. I mean, if Perez was more competitive with Max this year, would he have won the title? Maybe still, but would he have won it as convincingly? Not maybe necessarily if the start of the season there were points getting taken off Max by a more competitive teammate, hypothetically. So yeah, there was some further discussion on it as well, but the bottom line is that Lawson is coming in and is being told that, yeah, you're not the lead driver. Now, Lawson has himself said by the end of 2025, he wants to be in that position. He wants to get to Verstappen's level by the end of 2025. Will Lawson ever be backed by Red Bull in a position to actually be allowed to challenge Max? I don't think so. If you're Lawson, you're hoping that what Red Bull see in you in terms of potential is real. You can improve substantially. I don't think he's ever getting to Max's level, or maybe not even that close. But if he can get, you know, somewhat close to Max by his final season, I don't know, maybe Max then might step away, retire, even go to another team or leave the sport, do something else. Lawson then could be in a position to be Red Bull's new number one. But Lawson's never going to be the number one while Max is there. He's never going to be joint number one while Max is there. And of course, you realise this as a Red Bull driver, but you still do it because, you know, you get a chance in maybe one of the best cars and at one of the top teams. And if obviously Max decides to call it a day, then the opportunity's there. But Lawson says, yeah, I want to compete with the reigning champion in the very near future. And he may be good enough to do so, although that might be somewhat unlikely. But it doesn't matter if Red Bull aren't going to consider that in their analysis, I guess. Verstappen, by the way, was the number one driver of the year by the team principals. We saw this data yesterday. He was also number one driver of the year by the drivers themselves as well. These are the data points on that one. Very similar to what the team principals had to say. Russell a bit higher from the driver's point of view. Still, I'm not convinced this is actually a great list, but I'm intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. I'd still have Leclerc above Norris. I don't think Norris is bad this year year at all. I think he was pretty damn good. Certainly because I rate Piastri reasonably well, and Norris pretty much destroyed him in most categories this season, apart from the mental game, I might argue. But look, I think Leclerc was, to me, number 2. But again, both of the drivers and the team principals disagree with that. Russell was in 4th and Hamilton 10th, according to the drivers, which I thought was a bit surprising. Like, sure, Hamilton wasn't having his greatest year, but I feel like 10th is underrepresenting him probably quite substantially. I don't think that Russell and Hamilton should be this far apart, given their respective performances this season. Piastri, Sainz, I get it. Nice to see Hülkenberg on it too. I think Alonso, that's probably fair enough-ish in the 9th spot, I suppose. Gasly, I think there's a bit of recency bias, probably quite a lot of recency bias, actually. Yeah, he did a stellar job towards the end of the season, but he did spend most of the year getting beaten by Ocon. And Gasly was good. I rate Gasly very well, and I think it's nice to see him in the top 10. I just think where he got put to his 7th, and yeah, the team principals put him 10th, which I thought was probably more about right. But I thought 7th was a little bit much, but, the drivers, of course, they race these guys on the track. I do value their opinion, but of course they don't watch the races. So they get a feeling, but they don't watch the Grand Prix, if you see what I'm saying. The other thing to say as well is that Max was the number 1 driver, but it's not like every driver voted for Max. So all of the team principals voted for Max as the best, but only 8 of the drivers voted Max as the best. So less than half of the drivers put Max as the best driver of the year. Now, I imagine some drivers vote for themselves, or maybe they don't, I don't know, it depends who you are. And everyone who voted put him inside their top 4, which means someone put Max at 4th, which, I don't know, fair enough. Intrigued your thoughts in the comments below on who that may or maybe George Russell. I don't know, probably Russell would give him the credit in terms of one of these voting things, but we know, of course, they're not the best friends outside of the track right now. Piastri also admitted that he's got to do better from a qualifying perspective against Lando, because in most other categories, Piastri was good enough, but it's just he was out-qualified by Lando 20 times out of 24. I think that was the number, which of course isn't going to be good enough if Oscar wants to get to the level that he needs to be at. But let's talk about the cars for next year. We talked yesterday on the new Ferrari, the SF25, the Ferrari 677, whatever they're going to call it, and it's not going to be the 677, that's the code name, but we're taking SF23, SF24 and theorizing next year's car name. But they said they're only going to retain 1%, less than 1% of the parts. Everything else is going to change. Now, I think last year they said they were changing 95% of the car, and that they did, and this year's car was far better in some respects than last year's, but it still had its problems. Obviously, last year, it ate the tyres up during a Grand Prix, but was good in quali. This year was the other way around, but it was a better overall package. Next year, they're trying to make, not a mix of the two, but, what I'm trying to say. And they're doing so in a radical way by taking an awful lot of risk. So the question that I posed for you guys yesterday was, what are these other teams going to do? Because if Ferrari are taking all sorts of risk, 99% of their cars going to be new, changing the suspensions, making the gearbox smaller, which we'll discuss here in a second as well for the advantages that may potentially bring. If the other teams are going with straightforward evolutions of their concept, is that good for Ferrari or bad? Because it opens the door to maybe there is a higher performance ceiling of these cars than people believe there to be. Or, a Ferrari making a mistake if the other teams are just going to take evolutions and go from there. So we kind of want to know, especially Ferrari, what's going to happen for McLaren. Where are they going to stand on this whole debate? So Motorsport Italia, they dropped an article on it today and, talked about a number of these information pieces. So we'll scroll back up to the top because I was reading it and, we'll begin right about here. So we know that Ferrari are going to take this pretty radical approach. As Vasseur says, I have faith in the project we're working on. It'll still be an intense challenge just like the one just finished. We saw it again this year. 4 teams fighting on track. We must take a step towards further consistency. And, there's been a feeling that this decision to make substantial changes to the car, the bold idea of redoing the single-seater without limiting itself to merely a makeover, seems to have also been pursued by the other 3 contenders. Now, I want to do a bit more detail on Mercedes in the coming days. We'll talk about McLaren and Red Bull mostly here. But, the SF24 had probably fired all of its cartridges and development possibilities possibilities would have been limited compared to a car that is born almost from a blank sheet of paper. So maybe the realization was for Ferrari that this current car doesn't have that much more to give, and it was reasonably close to what it could achieve. So their feeling is, we need a new platform, we've got to start from the ground up again, take all the learnings of the last 3 years and put it into what's hopefully going to be a masterpiece. But of course, you know, it's inevitable that it will have some sort of flaw, you would imagine, as every brand new car will. But every car is flawed. You know, whether it's flawed badly enough to stop it winning the championship will be the question for Ferrari. And of course, it's going to be very good in certain aspects, I'm sure. But yeah, the feeling is brand new body of the car, pull rod front suspension, and a shorter gearbox. And this is pretty interesting as well, because this is something that Red Bull and Newey especially have really pushed over the last several years, is a small gearbox in general. Now, shorter doesn't necessarily mean smaller if it's also wider, but I'm assuming that they're going to try and make the gearbox smaller to allow it to use a certain rear suspension design, which is also pull rod, but with the aim of improving the traction of the car at the rear to then help it in qualifying laps, basically. But Red Bull really pushed the limit on how small they can make the gearbox to accommodate rear suspension ideas, and Newey loves to do that. He can minimize as much as possible. But we know that at the start of 2022, Red Bull was having quite a lot of gearbox issues, and even that is true today. Verstappen on the radio quite often is complaining about the gearing and just the gearbox in general, the way the shifting feels. So it does seem like Red Bull have paid a price for that sacrifice, and well, Ferrari, it seems, are willing to take a similar risk. But McLaren, they were the champions at the end of the day, and they made the following statements here from Andrea Stella. We took risks in the project choices. The approach to the next championship will be courageous because we will focus on innovation. So they're not quite going into the same detail as Ferrari with the whole 1% thing and the pull rod and all this stuff, but they have said the following. During the summer, when we approached the 25 car, we decided that we did need to make a leap in quality. If the ambition is also to aim for the driver's title, pretty funny this, right? That in the summer, they were like, oh, well, guess the drivers is over, but it wasn't over. Like, they still could have fought for it, and they realized that eventually, and then they kind of did, and then Max dominated Brazil, and then, of course, it was over. But pretty funny, right, that in the middle of the season, they were like, oh, we could win the Constructors this year. Maybe next year we can win both. And then I think everyone else was looking from the outside saying, you can win both this year if you tried. And eventually they did try. But we would like to make the championship a little more boring, he says. Now, this strikes to me as a man full of confidence, right? Because, you know, if you come out and win the Constructors marginally and you say, oh, next year we're going to try and make it much more boring, then you know, it definitely shows they think they've got some stuff in the pipeline and make it not as close as this year. But he says, in reality, I think it's going to be exciting with multiple teams challenging. But of course, he's talking innovation. He's talking that McLaren also think maybe there isn't that much more in their car. And again, their car had its weaknesses this year as well. So just quickly on Red Bull as well, because it's going to be a similar thing with them, but probably by necessity rather than by decision, right? Because the RB20 has many flaws. The concern, I think, for them is whether they have resolved them sufficiently with last year's car, whether they know how to resolve them sufficiently with next year's car, because Red Bull are still talking about problems with their correlation between the on-track data and what they see in the wind tunnel. So, you know, do they know exactly what to solve? Not clear. But look, the theory would go, because he won 2 of the final 4 races of the season at Brazil and Qatar, that they have certainly identified and solved some of the problems, but they will still need to rebuild a lot of the car from the ground up to fix those issues, which again creates risk and problems, but of course does open the door potentially to a better solution for all involved next year. So where do you guys sit on this debate so far? Ferrari have been quite clear in terms of what they're going to do. Red Bull, I think it's pretty evident they have to make reasonably substantial changes. To me, it's the McLaren one which is surprising. Now, he doesn't go into detail, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of last year's car that is considered for this year's McLaren, but the idea that they are being very innovative, and he even described it as courageous to take the steps they're trying to take, means, yeah, there could be some surprises next year, for good and for bad, in terms of the way that some of these top teams are performing. And as I say, we'll talk Mercedes in the coming days, because there's a few interesting pieces going on there as well. But very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.